Business World B-Side. I'm Patricia Mirasol. In this episode, I speak with Guilherme Canela, Director of the Division for Digital Inclusion Policies and Digital Transformation at UNESCO. He explains why access to information is a fundamental human right and why information isn't just paperwork. It actually saves lives. We also discuss the global challenge of connecting 2.6 billion people to the internet and how knowledge sharing improves government efficiency.
Good afternoon, Mr. Canela. I'm Patricia Mirasol, a multimedia producer at BusinessWorld. So today we are at the IDUAI 2025. So can you give us a very brief description of what this annual event is about?
Sure, always a pleasure to speak with you and everyone following us. In the universal system of human rights, the same right that protects freedom of expression actually protects access to information. So it is the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that every individual, every human being has the right to impart, which is the freedom of expression, the freedom of you journalists, to speak, but also every individual has the right to seek and receive information, ideas. So these two verbs, seek and receive, are actually the verbs that protect the right to access to information. Even the civil society, before the UNESCO in 2015, the General Conference of UNESCO approved the creation of this day, the civil society already celebrated this day with the name Right to Know. But then it was approved by the UNESCO General Conference as the International Day to the Universal Access to Information.
All right, thank you for that backgrounder. At the high panel discussion earlier, you and the rest of the panelists tackled some of the challenges to this access to information. My first question is, how is UNESCO promoting cross-border sharing of environmental data while respecting national sovereignty and data protection?
Well, what we do is to establish some parameters under the international standards for access to information in general, either within the national borders or outside of the national borders, but more and more recently, parameters on what we call data governance. For example, last year's 2024 International Day for Universal Access to Information, the main topic was actually access to data, which connects very well with this year because this year is broader on access to environmental issues, but of course a strong component is data about environment. So when we are establishing this guidance on these standards on data governance, one of the key elements of data governance is precisely how you protect these data from different ways. Privacy, how you protect privacy, how you protect the integrity of the data, how you do the sharing of this data while keeping these important characteristics. So what UNESCO itself does not do the sharing as UNESCO. We support our 194 member states to implement these kind of policies with certain criteria, but precisely the criteria are to protect what is embedded on your question, right? How you do that while guaranteeing these parameters.
All right, okay. And what concrete steps is UNESCO recommending to ensure environmental data is accessible and usable to non-technical communities, like for instance, fisher folks and farmers?
Well, the first thing is that countries should have an overall access to information law and hence an overall access to information policy. It's not only specific to environment. So every UN member state that have agreed with, for example, the 2030 agenda, there is a specific indicator, the SDG 16, about access to information. So this is the first recommendation. Countries should have a clear legal framework and clear policies on access to information. Now, regarding access to environmental information, there are, of course, specific steps that are related to what we call the Principle 10 of Rio 1992. Here, of course, there are the specificities of environmental discussions, either it's climate change or biodiversity and so on. And then we have been issuing specific guidance on that. But your question is actually very important because it's not only about a bureaucratic exercise. It's to guarantee that everyone, even if they are not experts on climate science or biodiversity science, they can understand that. And here it's really about making the information available in a way that is useful for every citizen. So we recommend important things like, for example, multilingualism is fundamental. You need to produce information in the main languages that are spoken in a given territory. That the information is also, the format of the information is also important. More and more, for obvious reasons, information is being delivered on a digital format, but we can't forget that in this planet, 2.6 billion people are still not connected. So if these people are not connected, you need to find other ways to guarantee that they also can, excuse me, they can receive this information. So the criteria is precisely that. We shouldn't leave no one behind, and the producers of information within the governments, they should pay attention in this kind of situation. So, for example, if the information about environment or about anything else is something that a community of blind people is requesting, maybe they should provide this in Braille language. If it is for people have people with certain kinds of disabilities related to hearing impairment, then the information should be provided in a different format. But the bottom line is that you need to be empathic with whoever is asking the information and provide in a way that is useful for them.
Right, makes sense. Okay. And are there any pilot projects you can point to that can actually that illustrates your point about how to be creative in imparting necessary information?
The first thing, it's important to show that the access to information, public information, is not a bureaucratic exercise. It really can change lives and save lives in many ways. I can give you, the people following us, a very concrete example. A few years ago in Brazil, a journalist asked the Brazilian Air Force how many human organs the aircrafts of the Brazilian Air Force transported every year. And why this is important in a country like Brazil? It's a huge country, as everyone can see in the map. So if someone donating an organ is in the very far north of Brazil and the receiver is in the very far south, the only way this organ can reach the person that needs it is using an aircraft. And normally is the Air Force, the service which does that. And this journalist received the information from the Air Force. He found out that in 6 months there were transported 5 organs. 1 heart, 2 livers, whatever. And then he did his journalist work. Is this too much, too few? It's okay. And he found out that it was too few. Why it's only 5? So he dig it, and he found out that the reason why they were transporting such a few amount of organs, it's because the aircrafts were prioritizing the transportation of politicians. So, for example, a senator, a minister, and so on. So he published this story, and it was an outcry, of course. So the president of the time issued a decree saying that there is always an aircraft of the Brazilian Air Force dedicated only to the transportation of organs. 6 months later, he did the same question again. And he found out that in the other period of 6 months, 175 organs were transported. So you can see that this freedom of information request, this access to information request, saved more than 170 lives. So it's not a metaphor when we say that information saves lives. And like that, you have examples on how access to information has improved educational policies, environmental policies, health, public health, and so on. So We need to, at the end of the day, to convince not only the population, but also the civil servants, also those working with the state, with the government, that they shouldn't treat this as another bureaucracy, as paperwork. They should treat this as something that really can change the things, can make the policies better, can make the population actually to achieve what is this relationship government and taxpayers and citizens, that at the end of the day is about improving policies for improving life conditions.
That was such an excellent example of how access to information can actually save lives.
Exactly, not make it just to tick the box, right? Consider this as an instrument. If you are a civil servant, if you work for the Ministry of Health or Education, or consider the access to information as your ally. Because if the citizens are asking questions about some particular issue, you need not to consider this, as I said, as a burden. You need to say, well, if they are asking, this is because they are interested or because this service is not working properly. So then use this as a relevant information for improving the policy. At the end of the day, this should be the purpose and not just ticking the box, we have the law, we have this. No, it's how we change the reality, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you, sir. To move on to a different topic, which digital innovations, such as, let's say, satellite data or open data platforms, does UNESCO see as the most scalable for low and middle income countries?
I mean, the first thing is that the countries, any country, but particularly those you mentioned, they need to have a data strategy. They need to have a data governance strategy. The first important thing is you need to get your community of data experts. Either they are scientists, or they are people already working for the government, or they are other data experts in civil society and so on, and try to say, well, what are the needs of the country in terms of data? How we can build a national strategy that protect this data of our citizens, our data, what is being called now data sovereignty, in a moment that the AI machines are trying to scrap all the available data. So how? You have a national policy that protects that. But at the end of the day, the secret is this, why you want this data for. So what is the strategy in the horizon? Because the data itself is meaningless if you don't have a strategy to transform this data in information, and also to transform this information in knowledge, which are different things. You can have a lot of data, but if you don't process it and transform it in information, it's not useful. And you can have a lot of information, but if you don't have any strategy to transform this information in actual knowledge, is also not the same kind of use you could have if you have a very comprehensive strategy. So UNESCO, with these different toolkits, capacity building for governmental officials, for civil servants, what we try to offer is, if you will, this kind of blueprints that the governments can use to improve their national data strategy.
I agree that data is nothing if it's not translated to useful information and it's not further translated into actionable knowledge. As you mentioned, information is a public good. And as one of the other panelists mentioned, actors, the different players of society, such as, let's say, civil society, they cannot do their role. So, like, for instance, they cannot do checks and balances on the government if they don't have the data they need. So access to information really is a human right nowadays. I don't have any other questions, Mr. Canela. Is there anything else you would like to share?
Well, just to follow up in one thing you said, I mean, of course, the access to information and access to data is an important driver for the accountability of the government's hands to fight corruption and so on. So all this is important. But we also need to look beyond that. Even if you were in an ideal situation that a particular government was incorruptible, still you will need to have access to information. Because the access to information, for example, access to data, can help a lot to increase the efficiency of the government. Because when you have a strategic plan to be transparent, to share this knowledge, to share this data, you reduce a lot of your transactional costs. One of the things that politicians do a lot in every single country in the world is to reinvent the wheel, is to do the same policy that someone already tried and maybe didn't work, or do the same policy and in a very slightly different way, but without using the knowledge that what happened before. So maybe, of course, we need to do this policy, but maybe we can do it in a way that learned from the mistakes and the success of the previous party or whatever that were in the government. So we need to understand that the access to information, the transparency, again, helps to fight corruption and so on. But aside that, it helps to save a lot of money, because helps you as, again, a policymaker in the area of health or education or environment to develop better policies, because you can learn from your own past, from your own evidence. And we need to convince the governments about this, that the access to information, it's a human right, is essential to guarantee other rights, because when you are asking an information about, for example, organs transplant, what you actually want to guarantee is your right to health. You are not actually concerned with your right to information. But if you don't have the right to information in the first place, you can't guarantee the right to health. But it's also super important to increase the efficiency of the machinery of the government and the state.
Right. So it's also not just about accountability, but also efficiency.
Exactly.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your insights, Mr. Canela.
A pleasure.
That was Mr. Guilherme Canela of UNESCO on the importance of universal access to information. From reducing corruption to saving lives, information is more than data. It's a tool for progress. This has been another episode of B-Side. Subscribe now and enjoy industry insights on Philippine business and beyond.